Hi, it's Sam here and welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to outline how the calorie idea has got completely out of control, has been completely misunderstood and has been complete BS in the way that's applied in all things to do with body composition, weight management and everything we're doing with the physique. Now, it's a little bit of a controversial claim, but stick with the video and I guarantee you're going to pick up at least something that hadn't occurred to you before, and some of these things should be a talking point. So if you want to clarify any of it and discuss, please put in the comments below. If you think it's useful information, please consider subscribing to the channel. And I'm going to start with really outlining what a calorie actually is, because it's got misconstrued as a substance when it's actually a measurement of a thing. Now that may sound pretty abstract, but it's very similar to something like a centimetre or a decibel, in that it's not a physical substance, it's a measurement within a conceptual framework. So things like amino acids, fatty acids, and single sugars, double sugars are actual substances in nutrition. Calories are not. Calories are just a measurement of energy, specifically the amount of energy that it takes to raise the temperature of, I think it's 1 litre of water, 1 degree centigrade or something like that. I may not be exactly right, but it's a measure of energy, not an actual substance within a thing. In the same way that you can have a plank of wood, and that wood could be oak or maple or whatever, but it's not made out of centimetres. It can be measured in centimetres. Similarly, you can have measurements of all sorts of different things that aren't a substance, and calories is like that. So it's not a substance that's going into the body and out of the body. So the theory is sometimes known as calories in, calories out, and that's in contrast with the carbohydrate insulin hypothesis of weight management. And that's the first problem with that whole conceptual idea. It's not a substance. The other problem with that whole idea is that once you eat it, consume it, it's technically still not inside the body. According to any biologist, any animal that swallows something, everything that's in their alimentary canal, that's everything through the mouth, down the esophagus, through down to the stomach and all the rest of it, is technically considered outside of the body still. And it's either absorbed through the intestines and assimilated, or it goes straight through. If it's gone straight through, it's never entered the body as far as a biologist would be concerned in this whole thing. So when people talk about, the calories in, calories out, you can't refute the laws of physics and thermodynamics and in a closed system, that's all completely wrong, because from the very first word, in, it's not technically in once you've swallowed it. That's a complete misunderstanding of the human body, and it's not a closed system. If you don't have an arsehole, maybe it's a closed system, or could be, but for almost all of us, it's not a closed system. So to take that idea further, to sort of break that down in a different way for you to understand, I could sort of say that every object in this room and every object around you has a value in calories. It has an amount of energy, and you determine the amount of, theoretically stored energy by burning that item with a Bunsen burner or in a calorimeter, and that would determine its calorie value. So, a pen or one of these books behind me, they've all got a calorie value, because everything does. And that's a bit of a strange way of looking at it, but it's very relevant here, because you'll say, well, those items aren't food. When you apply it to food, it's going to be completely different. But we do have nutrients that we know don't get absorbed at all, namely fiber, indigestible carbohydrates like cellulose and that kind of thing. So even within things that we do consider nutrients as opposed to random objects, they all have values in calories, but even the ones that are considered nutrients, we already know can't be absorbed and taken through at all. So, here's another example. My little sister, when she was a toddler, used to sit in the sandpit and eat sand. It didn't make her fat, it didn't make her gain any weight or anything like that. It was simply passed through. And that's, it's maybe too much information, a little bit gross, but that's what happened. It has a value in calories, and calories are just like everything else. And what people don't understand is that though we say a gram of fat has 9 calories, or a gram of protein or carbohydrate has 4 calories, those are actually even just averages. So when you burn and test all of the different foods that there are, it's actually different for different fats and different proteins and different carbohydrates in all the different foods. So those 4 and 9 are just averages, actually. So what do we need to understand instead? What we need to understand instead is that there's a process to fat loss and a process to fat gain. There is a way that once certain ingredients, that's actual physical substances, not energy, which isn't a physical substance, come into the body and are turned into fat. So what fat is actually made of in fat cells is triglycerides, and that's molecules of fatty acids and glycerol. And glycerol comes from glucose, which comes from either glucose in sucrose or glucose on its own, or glucose is bound up in starch. But all of it is carbohydrate. The only other way for glucose to come through is from protein through gluconeogenesis. But when we feed people nothing but protein, they starve and they die. So the body's not too efficient at making glucose and then glycerol out of protein. Even when it's left with just that, it won't force it to do it. So really, we're just talking about dietary carbohydrates that provide the glycerol. So for fat to be stored, to be formed in fat cells as triglycerides, you need those ingredients, the fatty acids, the glycerol, but you also need the hormonal instruction. And the hormonal instruction for storing fat is insulin. And that is triggered to be secreted by the pancreas to lower your blood sugar level, which is triggered obviously by those levels rising, again due to dietary carbohydrates. So what happens is the dietary carbohydrate provides one of the necessary ingredients for fat gain, along with the trigger for the hormonal instructions for fat gain. And when you have those with the fatty acids as well, which would largely come from the diet, that's when fat is stored. For it to be unstored, the reverse process happens. There's an absence of those things, or an absence of at least one of those things, and lowered insulin level, and fat is unstored from triglycerides in the fat cells. So that's how it actually happens. And all of that is not caused by calories. That whole mechanism of what's taking place there is a completely different idea and completely different reality to this idea that your body's somehow counting calories and has a balance of them, and if it has an excess of them, it gains, and if it has a deficit of them, it unstores. That's not how it works. How it actually works is what I just described with glycerol, fatty acids, insulin. But the reason why sometimes they're related to each other is because calories can be a proxy for those things that do actually cause it, because we're measuring all of the foods in calories, even though the calories are not a substance. So there's always going to be a calorie value for those ingredients that cause that process, but it's not calories or any mechanism in the body that's monitoring calories that makes that happen. Rewind that if that doesn't make sense. But it is a little bit hard to get your head around, and if you stick with the video, you're going to understand how we got to this position and why the myth won't go away. Because coming on to my next section here, the myth should go away because it's actually been disproven. So when we've done experiments with putting people in a theoretical calorie surplus or theoretical calorie deficit, they don't gain and they don't lose in the way that the numbers and the energy balance predict that they ought to, because the way that they predict that they ought to is the 3,500 calories idea, which means that basically, well, that comes from the idea that a gram of stored body fat in a human body contains approximately 3,500 thousand calories worth of energy, and therefore to use it up we have to deprive the body over whatever period of time it's going to be of 3,500 calories. But that, you should know now, if you've understood me and followed me so far, that there's nothing in your body that's actually monitoring this and storing or unstoring according to that balance. Is simply that number in calories can be a proxy for it, because the ingredients that are causing it and triggering the hormonal instructions to cause it all get assigned a calorie value. But it's not the calories that are doing it. And the reason we know that it's been disproven, and the reason we can take it all away from calories, is because those predictions that we should be able to make, if that's how the balance and the excess and the surplus and the deficit were how it worked, we'd be able to gain or lose body weight according to the number of calories given. So I'm going to reference two studies, like one for each direction, one for the calorie surplus and one for the calorie deficit. And these studies should give you, when I explain the foods used in them, should give you an idea that accords with everything else that I've said so far. So on the gaining side, we have the Vermont prison study. This is where they took a number of prisoners and they overfed them by giving them 10,000 calories per day, and monitored their weight gain over about 200 days or so. So if you say that a man, on average, his energy balance, if you believe, let's, for the sake of argument, assume the calorie theory is true and the energy balance paradigm is true. The average man needing about 2,500 calories or so, it means that he's going to be in a calorie surplus sufficient to gain 2 pounds of fat per day, because there's going to be 6,500 calorie surplus, on average, if these are average men. Per day. Obviously the surplus is going to get less if you go with the theory, because they're going to be gaining weight, and that means that they would have a new kind of threshold for what it would take to gain weight based on their new body weight. But after 200 days of eating in a surplus of 6,500 calories per day to start with, and then it trailing off, after 200 days, the average gain was 20 pounds, which is almost nothing when you consider what it ought to be if this theory was true. They should have been gaining 2 pounds per day by the start of this. If you didn't adjust for their new gaining weight, they'd be gaining 400 pounds. But obviously, if you're adjusting for that, it's going to be less than that, but not as low as 20. But the interesting piece of the Vermont prison study is what they're mostly feeding them, so that they can actually stomach it and it be less food volume, was like high fat. So they were eating pork, mostly. So they're eating pork, high fat meat, so mostly fat and protein and not too much carbohydrates, and 20 pounds average weight gain over 200 days should set you thinking. But it definitely accords with what I'm saying before about the carbohydrate insulin hypothesis and the lack of all the ingredients that would give you the glycerol from the glucose and the hormonal instructions from the insulin triggered by the glucose. All of that missing, or almost missing, 20 pounds over 200 days. Think about it. Now on the other side, you've got the most famous one, I suppose, is from the 1940s. You've got the Minnesota starvation study by Ansel Keys. He took men that were weight stable so they were exercised for a period and monitored for a period of 12 weeks to see what calorie intake he had them on with the foods that they were eating that kept them in balance. So this was actually This was actually an energy balance that wasn't purely theoretical. It was actually stabilized and tested and baselined over a 12-week period. And he baselined them at just over 3,000 calories per day. And then that was cut approximately in half. They're on just over 1,500 calories for 24 weeks. And the predicted weight gain was, the predicted weight loss was nowhere near what it should have been theoretically. They should have been losing, over that 24-week period, they should have been losing, a pound like every 2 days, according to the energy balance theory. They didn't lose anything close to that. They lost about 10 pounds or something like that, but they felt awful in the process, couldn't do anything except be obsessed by food, completely lost their sex drive, were having their hair fall out, lost 21% of their strength on average. If this sounds a lot like a calorie deficit diet and feeling shit, that's why. That's what you're doing there. Your body will just try and fight back if you try and eat less, and you get into the point where your body's giving you all the signals that this is a bad idea by triggering your hunger, and you ignore it and just keep pushing with less and less food. Your body doesn't give you the reward of the weight loss that's predicted by the whole energy balance nonsense disproven theory. Instead, it just gives your body trying to conserve energy by making you really tired and not want to do anything the rest of the time, and really grumpy and obsessed with food and not interested in anything else in life. If that sounds a lot like a competition prep for any of the bodybuilding crowd tuning in here, don't be surprised. That's what happens. So this is really important knowledge for me in bodybuilding, because I can do a contest prep, come in as good a condition as anyone in my class, or always have done. I'm not saying I'm the best across the board, far from it, but I've never been beaten in my class for condition. But the key thing, and what I want to share, is that I've never had to go hungry for it. I can be 1 or 2 weeks out from being leaner than I've ever been since my competition before, and be perfectly happy, perfectly high energy. I don't lose any strength. And this was even back in my UK DFBA, like Natty contest days. So it's not just the Winnie or something like that. It's no loss of strength when I've done it just on the food and just on the exercise, because I'm not going hungry, because I'm not trying to play a calorie deficit, because I'm well studied enough to know that it doesn't work. It doesn't give you the weight loss that it predicts, far, far, far from it. And you can lose weight without going hungry if you understand the carbohydrate insulin hypothesis. And so broadly, that means carbohydrate restriction. You can eat any amounts of fat and protein without gaining weight. To lose, you don't need to be pushing yourself super hungry. You can train more. You can eat a little bit less on the fat and protein, but not to the point of hunger. Gradually lose the weight, maintain all of the strength, and you can get the reward of all the fat loss that you wanted without going hungry. So it has been disproven. It has been disproven by those 2 studies. If the energy balance hypothesis was how things worked, it would be impossible for those studies to come in with those results that they did. But there's not any proof for it. We're told it's well proven and that this is how it works, but it's only ever calories are only ever used in all of these studies on nutrition as a foundational assumption, but it's always an unproven assumption. So when you actually go looking for the proof of the assumption, or the first premise in all of it is missing. But when you look for any disproof of it, it has been disproven, but the myth just won't go away. So why won't it go away? If this is turning into a bit of a rant, don't be surprised, because it actually makes me pretty frustrated, because the result is a lot of pain and misery for people that want to control their bodies, even if they just want to be healthier and lose weight, but they're constantly given the wrong advice by professionals or people well qualified, because the whole system is embroiled in this nonsense, because an orthodoxy is formed around this myth to the point that if you're qualified as a nutritionist or a dietitian, you're hammering this point home, or if you've got your personal trainer qualifications. You're parroting this calorie energy balance nonsense that's been disproven. And so the myth perpetuates. So why is this happening? Well, the reason why it's happening is because it benefits the food industry to keep selling more and more and more and more foods, and the most highly profitable foods, the ones that can be stored longest on the shelf and are the cheapest to produce, and they're the most addictive, and so they're the biggest money maker and the lowest costs on their end, are all the carbohydrate and sugar foods. So they end up with the most money, which means that they have the most influence to sponsor all of the courses, sponsor all of the conferences, all of the, the strings of influence in all of these things, and they don't want to take any responsibility or cut the profit margin for them and their shareholders. So they basically pass the wrong advice on, the wrong advice perpetuates, and so it's kind of like it's your fault if you got the calories numbers wrong, because you didn't add up your calorie deficit or stick to it properly. And the reality is it wouldn't have worked how any of us would have predicted or would have expected anyway, and will just mess you up. But it goes on and on and on and on, because there are very few people that are willing to kind of stick their neck on the line and get called an idiot because they disagree with the experts and the orthodoxy in all this. But I got nothing to lose by saying this, I'm just here to help. I'm just passionate about these things. This is my channel, so I'll say whatever the hell I want, and I'll say it's rubbish, and I hope that helps someone out there. And I will keep saying that it's rubbish until, well, probably forever, because it probably won't change anything. But I do frequently help people to get in the best shape that they've ever been in without having to go hungry, and without having to have a lot of the problems associated with trying to starve yourself into weight loss or superior condition there. And that's not the end of the problems with it. You can think you'll get to eat more by having more of a balanced diet, as they call it, and less fat because that's less calories, but you'll only make yourself feel ill ultimately, because fatty acids are essential to the body and carbohydrates aren't. And once you start trying to cut the foods that we're told are bad, that are higher in fat, and especially saturated fat and all of that nonsense, and eating less of the most nutrient-dense foods like red meats and eggs and things like that, the worse you're going to feel. And who wants that? I'd rather say what I know to be right and hopefully help someone out there. And I hope that this little rant today has allowed you to get to know me a little bit better, the particular topics that I've taken the most interest in the whole physique journey. And I'll follow up on this at some point, I'm sure, because it does lead to more challenges and more questions. But if you've ever thought this sort of thing works, just consider how calories have been a proxy for something else. So consider whether you could track in anything you've ever done that the expected and deficit and energy balance predicted body changes ever actually materialized. And consider also how you felt in the process, and whether your body was fighting back or whether you felt healthy and a good sense of well-being in general. And well, that brings me to the end of today's rant. I'm sure I'll have to pick up on it at some point, but I hope to have given you a theoretical and intellectual justification for why I'm literally a complete meathead. Cheers.